Welcome to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Townsend-Gard. I'm a law professor, and I just want to quilt. Susan Blexrud is a romance author. She is a quilter. She is also the mother of one of my students. We had a great time chatting. I can't wait for you to hear them. Note, we had a little bit of technical difficulties. Ironic, since her son is the producer of our show. And we had to start again.
So I am Susan Blexrud, and I live in Orlando, Florida.
Awesome. And we were talking about, we had some technical difficulties. So you were talking to me about quilting and sort of, let's start from there. So tell me about your quilting life and why you like quilting. And you were talking about having retired, and then we got cut off twice. So it was very rude. The internet was very rude.
Okay. It was. It was being its typically rude self.
Exactly.
So, I didn't. After my children were grown, and so I have Chris, and then I have a daughter who's 3 years younger than Chris. I didn't. There were no more Halloween costumes or flower girl dresses or ring bearer suits or anything to make. So I never particularly liked sewing for myself. I'm mostly sewing from the kids, and I did a lot of home deck stuff as well. But when we were moving to the mountains, I was just looking at the area in Appalachia and the history of Appalachia, and how in the 1800s women would fashion quilts out of the best parts of material of old clothing. So, they would take something that would ordinarily be a throwaway, and they would cut out the good non-frayed sections and fashion a work of art. And so it was practical, it was recycling, and it ended up, even though I'm sure the first ones weren't works of beauty, they ended up being beautiful. And so that fascinated me. And, supposedly it was about 1976 with the country's bicentennial when the resurgence of quilting really started.
Right.
They were displaying those quilts from the founding of our country, and people really started to get back into it.
Right, right.
That really, because quilting was so passé for a long time, but 1976 was kind of the beginning of my understanding is the more modern quilting world.
Right. It's so funny. So did you quilt in the 70s and 76, 77, that period of time?
No. I didn't. I started quilting about 12 years ago.
Interesting.
And I bought a book about making a log cabin pattern, making that square. And so I started with a log cabin. And I rarely make a pattern twice because for me, it's such a good exercise in math, and I'm kind of math challenged anyway, that I always like to try something new and alter it in some way that math is involved.
Yeah.
It's just, I feel that it's good for my head. So, I can send you pictures of some of the quilts I've made.
I'd love it. That'd be great.
Okay,
so
I will do that.
So what is it about? So what is it about quilting that you like?
I think probably my favorite part of it is that because I have a history of sewing and I have a history of color and how materials go together and blend, that probably my favorite part is choosing the material for a quilt.
That's interesting.
Yes.
And do you do modern stuff or traditional stuff? What do you do? What kind of quilts are you drawn to?
I would say that they're traditional in terms of their geometry, but I like more modern materials, and I like white space. So
yeah, I do too.
I think more of the first quilts I made were really, really busy, and the longer I quilt, the less I'm inclined to do the busy, like stars everywhere. And
yeah, why do you? I feel
everywhere.
The same way. Why do you feel that way? Why are you getting less complicated, or are you just not really into super busy? Like, is it aesthetic, or is it just enough with all the little pieces?
I think. Well, I think it's aesthetic, and I go to a lot of quilt shows. So I see a lot of the modern quilts, which really look like oil paintings. You know, I mean, they don't resemble quilts. And I will never get there. I don't, that kind of skill level I will not attain. But I think most quilters, you know, I watch Fons and Porter's show all the time, which I really enjoy. Most quilters, even if they've been quilting most of their lives, can attain an intermediate level.
Yeah.
But rarely go beyond that.
Interesting. So you think there's like people max out on their skill level or their artistic level in terms of quilting, that you can only get so far on like perseverance alone?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do. There's a point. There's a point at which talent, you know, yes, of course, hard work and persistence can take you a long way. But I think the creativity, I think a lot of those modern art quilters don't have a traditional quilting background, they have an art background.
Got it. Yeah,
so,
we've interviewed a couple of them, and they really are. They're even like, it's interesting to talk to them because they're like they don't want to be judged on the quilting scale. They want to be judged on the art scale, which I thought is really interesting, that they see it totally differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Well, I mean, and of course the techniques are completely different, and I mean, they're usually not traditionally bound. They're not quilted in a traditional fashion. I mean, but they are still quilted.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I just went to a show in Orlando the Saturday before last, and, I looked so closely at some of the art quilts and the quilt stitching on them. And it's also a layering. There's so much applique in it that sometimes it's actually more applique than it is quilting.
Interesting.
So, yeah, it's layer upon layer, putting fabric on top of fabric, and then using decorative stitching to applique it on there. It's completely different. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Interesting. So tell me
and
about,
also what I find.
Go ahead. Sorry,
I was just going to say that in the quilting world too, now it used to be that there was one quilting guild, and now in Orlando, for instance, there is a modern quilt guild and a traditional quilt guild.
And do you belong to either of them?
I don't. I belong to the quilt guild in Asheville. But I don't belong to a quilt guild down here. So.
And so what do you think, why do you belong to a quilt? Well, I mean, what made you choose to belong to one in one area and not the other? And do you like being part of a quilt guild?
Well, I don't go to many of the meetings because they're at night, and I really am not crazy about driving around the mountains at nighttime.
Yeah.
But I like that they sponsor a big quilt show every year, the last weekend of September.
Oh, that's nice.
And they bring in just great speakers and do workshops, and I think that is the primary draw for me.
Yeah.
Around 2 years ago, they had the president of Moda
Oh, how cool.
come, and he is an amazing acquirer of quilts, and so everywhere he goes, he buys quilts, and I love Moda fabrics anyway, and but he talked a lot about where fabric is made today, and it's the designs are done in the U.S., then India, because India bought many of the machines, the old machines, when we were a textile company. Country. When we were a textile country, we used to dye fabrics, and so we don't do that much anymore. That's done in India, and then the fabric goes to China, where the material is actually made, based again on U.S. design, and then it comes back to the U.S.
Interesting.
So,
very interesting.
Very little fabric is not made here.
So you are a super creative person. Not only do you quilt, but you write. Can you tell us a little bit about your writing?
Well, I was my working life. I was the communications director for the city of Orlando. So most of what I wrote were political speeches and press releases and feature articles, and so I did that. I had my own PR firm here in Orlando, and then I went to work full time for the city of Orlando. But when I retired, I just wanted to try my hand at fiction. So it was the beginning of the vampire craze, and Twilight, had just come out, and I've always been fascinated by vampires, and I love the Dracula story. So my first series of books were about vampires, and I had a little publisher that they were very, very nice, but they weren't doing any marketing, and I was driving myself crazy trying to market. And then I switched to another publisher and wrote 3 more books for my second publisher, and I really liked them, but they also just didn't have a machine to be very supportive. And then 2 years ago, Simon & Schuster bought them, and I really felt that my timing was just off, because I had already blown it. I'd already blown my creative writing wad.
Because you had already written 6 books by that point, right?
So yes, and so I poured so much time and effort into marketing, and I spoke at book clubs and at libraries and University of Central Florida and Barnes and Noble, and so I was doing that, and I just wasn't really selling anything, and I not that I was doing it to be an A-list writer, but the remuneration just wasn't up to the effort. Yeah. So much effort.
Do you feel like you were writing? Let me ask you a question, because we talk about this in copyright a lot. So do you feel like your motivation for writing the fiction was, what was the motivation? Was it personal? Was it that it might make money? Was it both? Kind of like, what motivated you to write those first 6 novels?
Well, initially I just wanted to be published, and the money really didn't matter to me. And I had a critique group in Nashville, and there were 4 of us, and we were all retired from other jobs. We had an attorney in there and somebody who worked for Viacom, and it was a great little group of gals, and so we met every week and read each other's work, and I enjoyed that process, but we were all really just doing it to be published. We weren't really doing it to make a living at it.
And so what happened once you were with Simon & Schuster?
Well, I think that, I probably could sell more